Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, joined as always by Scott Dunford, pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California. And you are you, and we're so glad you've joined us today on the show. If this show ends up being a blessing to you, go ahead and share it with a friend and also leave us a positive rating and review in your podcast platform of choice. We are over 300 episodes into this show, Scott, over 360 episodes into this show. The Lord's been so kind to us over the last 7 years. Can you believe that, brother?
I wonder if there's anyone who's listened to all of those. I don't think I have.
I know that I haven't, for sure. And speaking of things that are humbling, Scott, let me tell you just a little story as we dive into our conversation with our esteemed guest today. And of course, listeners have already clicked and know the title and know what we're going to be getting into today. But I was at a conference last year, and there was a couple of different authors with a particular publisher that were asked to sit down and do book signings and to be available to sign books that they had written. And I'm sitting at one table, you know, with my little book that I've half authored here with Chad Vegas, Missions by the Book. And well, our guest is sitting at the table next to me, and he's got the line going out the window. And I've got like one person comes over and says, hey, buddy, how you doing? And so I was humbled in that moment. And, you know, the Lord uses things like this to knock us down a rung. And of course, the fellow that was beside me that day is the fellow that we're speaking to today, right?
Yeah, so we're glad to welcome Dr. Voddie Baucham, pastor, church planter. I first met you, and I don't know if you would definitely not know this because I met you in my living room on a DVD from Passion 2000. I don't even know if you can remember that. Most of our listeners.
I remember the living room.
Yeah, yes. And I remember, you know, this is an unusual name, and I was really challenged by all those messages. But that's where I was first introduced to you. He was raised in a non-Christian home, converted during college, and is well known in his ministry for his preaching, dealing with a whole lot of topics related to culture, and holds degrees from Southeastern, a DMin from Southeastern, and serving at African Christian University. So tell us a little bit more about your ministry and what led you from pastoring to go all the way to Zambia in ministry, and even help us understand a little bit about Zambia. I embarrassed myself for our listeners offline by asking about Zanzibar, which is actually in Tanzania, which I knew that, but clearly I don't know anything.
You just didn't know it enough.
Anything about Zambia. So how close is it to Wakanda?
You're right next door, actually right next door. No, thanks guys for this opportunity. This is awesome. I love to get the opportunity to talk to people about mission and our mission personally, the mission that we have as Christians, the mission that we share, and the way that just sort of grows and develops in our lives individually and collectively. My family and I have been here in Lusaka, Zambia, the capital city, for the last 8 years. We made 8 years actually in August. When we came, we said we were coming for 3 to 5 years. And now we've been here 3 plus 5. Wow. So, it's kind of how the Lord works. Zambia is geographically located in South Central Africa. We're landlocked. And so below us is Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, and then we have to our west Angola, to our north the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to our east we have Malawi and Mozambique, and to our northeast we have Tanzania. So we're completely landlocked. It is about the size of Texas.
Wow.
If you want to think about the landmass, and it's got about somewhere 16 to 18 million people. The median age in Zambia is somewhere around 15, 16. It's a very young country, growing country. It's probably the most stable country on the continent, probably the most peaceful country on the continent. There's never been any civil wars here or anything like that. It's had more peaceful transfers of power than any other country on the continent. It's a constitutionally Christian republic. So in the preamble to the Constitution of Zambia, it identifies Zambia as a Christian nation, which I've gotten a huge kick out of with all the recent, brouhaha in the U.S. about Christian nationalism, about white Christian nationalism. And I'm like, okay, where does that put Zambia? This black
or
African,
Uganda. Yeah.
Yeah. Where does that put these countries? But anyway, and that's part of the reason that we're here. It's part of the reason that the African Christian University is here. We came to help start ACU. We got here in August. ACU started about 6 months later. And it's a university, a classical Christian liberal arts university, started by the Reformed Baptist churches of Zambia. I came to Zambia for the first time in 2006 and, had an opportunity to be here and to minister among those brethren. There's a vibrant, healthy, 3.5 decades old Reformed Baptist movement here. So it's just a really strategic place and a really strategic opportunity and an incredible fit for me in terms of my gifts, talents, abilities, and desires. It's probably a long way around to answering your question, but
that's what we need to hear.
Hey, listeners, are you interested in free theological training? Midwestern Seminary exists for the church, and that vision to be for the church is the reason that they provide free resources for anyone who wants to grow in their faith. How do they do that? Through the For the Church Institute, which offers free seminary-level education to any individual interested in growing in their knowledge of Scripture, knowing the Lord more deeply, and discerning their calling in ministry. With courses ranging from New Testament and theology to the doctrine of the Trinity, find out if the For the Church Institute is the right solution for you to deepen in your knowledge of Christ. Go to mbts.edu/FTCI. Again, that's mbts.edu/FTCI for the Church Institute. And while you're there, let them know that the Missions Podcast sent you. And now, on to our show. You've already kind of given us an overview of the landscape in Zambia, obviously very different from the United States, which is, well, let's just say it's not quite a Christianly constituted republic right now. And I'm sure our median age is also older than you would see in Zambia right now. And so what has that been like going from the Bible Belt in Texas to there? And specifically, we hear this conversation come up every now and again in the missions world of quote unquote reverse missions. I don't think that's an accurate term, but this idea of, for so long we've sent missionaries from the West to places like Zambia. And is it time to start sending missionaries, frankly, the opposite direction? Or are there other things happening that you're seeing there on the ground?
Yeah, I think of it differently. I think of it more from an individual perspective. I think there was a time when we thought about missions in terms of global parts of the world, unreached parts of the world, and we still do to a certain extent for certain parts of the world, right? There's and until everyone is heard, we're still going to have those pockets, those places where, we have to try to send people for pioneering missions. But I think for the most part, what we see is God preparing people in various settings and putting them in positions providentially where their gifts, talents, abilities, desires, and opportunities allow them to be planted where they're needed. And sometimes that means, a situation like mine where, I'm going from Texas coming to Zambia, but there are also people in the United States who have come from Zambia or, other parts of Africa or other parts of the world. And because of their gifts, talents, abilities, desires, and providential circumstances, they're now planting churches or, in the United States or planting churches in the United Kingdom or wherever. So, I'm with you. I'm not a fan of the whole, reverse missions concept. I think it's a lot more organic than that. And the reason that I'm encouraged by that is because I think what a lot of our approaches to missions lead us to do is to think about missions in terms of Green Beret, Navy SEAL Christians, who are these special people who go places and do special things, as opposed to us thinking about missions in terms of God preparing all of his people to be about his mission. And for some of those people, that ends up being cross-cultural. Because the fact of the matter is, I was a church planter in Houston. So I was involved in mission work in Houston, right? I didn't come here to be a missionary. I'm a missionary who happened to come here.
So help us understand a little bit more about Africa and how it's laid out. I was just looking at a map and some things are coming back to my mind. To the north, you said there's yeah, it's always helpful when your mind works. So to the north is Congo, right? The Democratic Republic of Congo, which is mostly French speaking. A book I don't know, you may have read this book. I read it a while back called King Leopold's Ghost, which exposed the huge genocide of the Congo by the Belgian government. And it was something I'd never heard about before at all. But that's just to the north of you. But Zambia was part of Rhodesia, which was an English colony, correct?
Yeah. So Zimbabwe would be Rhodesia. Zambia was northern Rhodesia.
Okay. And so is there any kind of like culturally, between the English speaking parts and the French speaking parts, is there a crossover? Do you see Christians going from a place like Zambia into the Congo, or is the ministry limited to the English speaking or French speaking world? How does that work out in Africa?
Yeah, there tends to be a lot less of that overlap between borders, compared to, say, in the U.S., you see things between Canada, Mexico, the United States, that kind of flow. There is some of that. There would be a lot more interaction between, say, Zambia and Zimbabwe, because of their histories, than there would be between, we got Portuguese speaking former Portuguese colonies on either side. So Angola and Mozambique, right? That's the Portuguese speaking world. And so you don't see a lot of interplay or overlap. And then the Congo, the French, you don't see a lot of interplay or overlap there. But there is from time to time. But Congo is also very unstable and war torn. And so there's, a lot less interplay because of that also.
So would you say then that you're seeing challenges to the gospel spreading as a result? And the reason for us asking is we do look at the ministry that you're able to have there in Zambia. It seems like the Lord is at work, right? There's this movement for 35 years or so. There's a classically based Christian university that's happening there. The government has a Christian identity or consensus behind it. What are the challenges then? What is left for the gospel to do in a context like Zambia?
Well, and therein lies the rub. That's why ACU was so important, because Zambians recognize, the Zambian Christians here, these Reformed confessional Christians here, they recognize that while it's great to have a constitutionally Christian republic, well, it's great to have that written into the Constitution. The Christian foundations were lacking. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting. I came from a country that is not identified as a constitutionally Christian republic, but everything about it, everything about its fiber and its history and its culture is rooted and grounded in the Christian worldview that shaped its founding. And now I move here to a country who has the statement in the Constitution, but doesn't have those roots and those foundations. In fact, they have very different roots and foundations: African traditional religion, African traditional worldview. So basically you have, this statement of Christianity that is sort of pressed down on top of this culture of African traditional religion and African traditional worldview. And so there is that clash there between the roots and the core and the stated desire. So it's a very different kind of approach to things.
I just want to remind our listeners, it's been a long time since we've had Conrad and Bayway on our show, but his interview that we did with him on African tribal religion, I highly recommend people go back and kind of check that out, especially related to what we just heard from Voddie. So how do you approach then theological education and discipleship in that kind of a context, and how does it differ from what you've done in the States? And then what would you say American churches could learn from what's happening in Zambia?
Yeah, it's really interesting that, one of the things, because of all of that, these Reformed Baptist churches did is they didn't start a seminary. They didn't start a Bible college. They started a university.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I run into people all the time. We've been here for 8 years. I've been talking about ACU for 8 years, more than that, right? Since before we decided to come here. Very clear about the fact that it is a classical Christian liberal arts university, offering degrees in agriculture and business and, education and theology and trying to move into, the hard sciences and other things. But I tell you, if I talk to 10 people, 8 of them are going to ask me about our Bible college, because that's the only thing that they can conceptualize, right? It must be a Bible college. It must be a seminary, right? Because that's what missions is about, right? It's about starting Bible colleges. It's about starting seminaries. And we just have to continue to tell people, no. Our mission is to, not just get them baptized, but to teach them to observe all things, right? That he has taught us, that he's commanded us. And so we're about building those foundations that much of Western civilization has come to take for granted. So for example, I teach a class called Theology, Worldview, and Ethics. It's part of the core curriculum. By the way, even our agriculture majors that will graduate with 24 to 27 hours in Bible and theology, right? Mm-hmm. Even our science majors, because the core curriculum, right? And I teach theology, worldview, and ethics in our core curriculum. And basically what I'm doing is I'm taking, confessionalism, and I'm taking, the Decalogue, and talking about how to build, practical understanding of Christian ethics from the Decalogue. 3 types of law, 3 uses of the law, so on and so forth. And so one of the ways that I always illustrate this for my students is, Lusaka is the capital city, a couple of million people here. The overwhelming majority of people walk everywhere they go, but we don't build sidewalks. People's houses and businesses are behind wall fences, and people put their wall fence all the way at the edge of their property, so people have to walk in the streets. And people are run over and killed almost every day, right? And so I talk to them about the 6th commandment, right? The 6th commandment, you shall not murder. There is what we shall not do, but there's also what is required of us, which is the protection of human life. And so I tell my students this: I want ACU to be known as the university that produces people who build sidewalks, right? Because it's not just about telling people how to go to heaven when they die. If we understand the Imago Dei, and we understand, the way the gospel transforms us, then we also have to understand the value of human life and be the kind of people who build sidewalks, because people matter to God. And if you can conceptualize that, then you kind of get what we're trying to do at ACU.
And I think it would be maybe not new information for everyone listening, but to realize that, the Bible college movement is a newer movement in history. Absolutely. And in many ways, it's an evangelical, trend and pattern that arose in response to certain things, especially coming out of the fundamentalist modernist controversies. And really people were sort of bunkering down and let's just do our thing. Meanwhile, we were sort of living off of the fumes and coasting off of the fumes of really everything that came in terms of education Christianly throughout Western culture before that, because for generations we had the sort of foundations that you're talking about.
Right. And so now that goes back to what I was talking about with, the differences that I've seen coming here. It's like we're trying to intentionally do through our work at ACU, those things that Western civilization is built upon, but takes for granted, which has been a fascinating work, but also incredibly challenging.
It's also encouraging to me because I see multiple poles at work in the evangelical world, not POLLS, POLES.
Yeah.
And Scott and I have talked about this before on the show too. There's this sort of fight or flight thing happening. Do we leave godless places and build communities that are rooted in the types of historic Protestant teaching that you're talking about? Or do we integrate among the lost masses, and do we send more missionaries rather than huddling up? And different communities and churches are going to answer those questions prudentially and differently based on where they are. And I think we acknowledge that not all contexts are the same.
Yeah.
But it seems like sometimes this missionary impulse is pitted against the desire to lay the foundations again, to build Christian culture that's rooted on the gospel, not rooted on the trappings of Western culture that isn't informed by the gospel, but that's rooted directly in Scripture, maybe in some of the ways that you've described. Sometimes these impulses are kind of pitted against each other. Do you ever find yourself sort of having to say to people in our tribes, hey, we still have to love the nations, not just the nation?
Yeah, exactly. We do have to do that. And interestingly enough, I have to do that more here. Mm-hmm. And the reason I have to do that more here is because Africa and Africans, by and large, for a long time, have seen themselves as recipients in terms of mission, right? This is the place that missionaries come to. It's not the place you launch missionaries from. And so that's another barrier to, you asked the question about, ministry to these nations around us. And that's one of the things that we're trying to inculcate into Christian culture in Zambia as well, right? How do we become a light to the nations that surround us? And just getting people to think in those terms is oftentimes very difficult. Even from a practical standpoint, because, this is a developing nation. And so people are like, hey, man, we need infrastructure. We need roads. We need doctors. We need, right. We need to literally build foundations and infrastructure, not just spiritually. Right. But, and so the idea that you would think about, no, I'm going to go to, neighboring countries, in order to advance the kingdom and spread the gospel, that's something that, from a very pragmatic standpoint, becomes difficult to think about. But we're seeing that in different ways. We're seeing people from other nations come here to ACU as well. Our first graduate was South African. We've had people from Rwanda, people from the Congo, people contacting us from all over the region. And as far away as, Ethiopia, talking about a desire to come and study at ACU. So we're hopeful that will change.
What have you learned, just in your time there? Clearly Christianity of some sort, and probably Anglican. I'm guessing it was Anglicanism that initially came to Zambia. What did you look at that you say, hey, these are early missionaries that came in, they did right? But what are some of the things that you're looking back and say, hey, I wish this is what we're learning from the mistakes of the past? What have you learned, even just looking backward in history, that we could learn from as far as what we're doing in maybe totally non-Christian contexts?
Yeah. And when you talk about early, Christians here, one of the 7 wonders of the world is here in Zambia. And in order to go see that 7th, wonder of the world, Victoria Falls, you'd have to go to a town called Livingstone, that's named after David Livingstone. And this was David Livingstone's stomping grounds in his mission work. And Zambians are incredibly grateful for that work that was done. I think, a couple of things that have been sort of pointed out to me, and maybe Conrad talked to you about some of this, but if somebody tells you Zambian tells another Zambian where they're from. For example, a Zambian tells Conrad, I'm from, this place or whatever. He can tell them what their denomination most likely is, because early mission movements basically divided up the country and said, this area is yours, that area is yours, that area is yours. And did the work, in that way. And another problem, of course, was, that you've got the problem of rice Christians, this idea of, we come and we bring resources, and when we bring our resources, everybody's happy to get the resources. So they're happy to, accept whatever it is that we're saying to them because of the resources, so there are those types of things. And then, of course, there's the shallowness. And so people, have come, and it still, happens. They come in, they do some evangelistic work, and I put the, evangelistic in air quotes there. They do some evangelistic works. They give somebody training that's this much above Sunday school, and then they, call them a pastor. And you get people who'll say things like, we planted, 400 churches, over the last couple of years. And I'm going, yeah, I don't know what you're doing, but you're not planting churches. Cause it doesn't happen like that. What you're doing is something very different than that. And so you run into a lot of people in a lot of places where things are, a mile wide and half an inch deep. People have very little understanding of the fundamentals, very little grounding theologically. Indigenous Zambians are kind of left, to pick up the pieces. So yeah, there's some train wrecks that have been left.
Absolutely. And understandably, anytime we step outside of our culture, it gives us a new perspective on our own as well. And you're somebody who, even though you've relocated about 8 years ago now, you are about to go on another short preaching tour, right? You've remained active in some ministry, at least publicly, in the U.S. And I know it's been, just an interesting last couple of years, right? What are the things that you see culturally differently? Because now you've been able to step outside of it, and yet you look at the news in the U.S. or you look at different things that are happening within the church, and hopefully fresh perspective that allows you to see something that maybe sometimes we're blind to.
It's interesting, and people are always amazed when I say this, but living outside of the U.S. and I go back 3 to 4 times a year, has made me far more hopeful about the church in America than I ever was before. And I think what happens is it's kind of like as parents, as parents, we look at our children and we're constantly discipling and disciplining and correcting our children. We see all of the work, right, that needs to be done with our children. We get tired, we get frustrated. And then somebody comes from the outside and says, man, your kids are awesome. And we go, wait, these kids?
You're right.
You mean these kids right here, And I think what happens when you're so close is, we get so caught up with the things that are wrong and the things that are negative. But, I've been in, 50 some countries now, and there's no place like the U.S. For one reason, because of federalism. There's 50 states, right? And that's incredibly unique. So not everywhere is New York and California.
Thank goodness, right, Scott?
Yeah, amen. Not everywhere. Not everywhere is like that. And, that's one thing. But secondly, there's 350 million people. And there are thousands of prophets who have not bowed the knee to Baal.
Yeah.
There are so many universities and seminaries and podcasts and, so many theologians writing books. And, how many Americans can name 5 theologians whose, work they think everybody ought to be reading who are not Americans? You can't do it because the overwhelming majority of the meaningful, profitable theological work that's going on is coming out of America. The most influential churches, the most influential preachers, it's coming out of America. And again, there are thousands of prophets who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And there is a rich theological heritage and incredibly rich theological work. But there's also a lot of whining and complaining from people who just don't know how bad it is in other places.
Does it surprise you, Alex?
Does it surprise me that people whine and complain? No,
No,
it
well,
doesn't.
no, not that. But just his answers. I'm just curious if his answer surprises you.
That I didn't necessarily anticipate that you'd say that, Voddie. I think you're right. I think that just in general, I think we're blind to, Jesus tells Nicodemus, you can't see the kingdom without regenerate eyes.
Yeah.
And there's so many people looking for the kingdom. And one thing that I'm often pointing people back to is look at the fruit of the kingdom. It's in the ground that you're standing on, whether it looks like it's going well right now or not, in whatever controversy or crisis that's happening in the news. We are standing on the shoulders of so many generations of spiritual giants. And going to a place like Zambia where, okay, we're formally Christian, but the foundation is this deep. It's very thin compared to what we have here. And again, because there's this conflict between the stay and build culture here versus the go and tell and reach the nations impulse, because there's that conflict there. Well, maybe there shouldn't be. Maybe it's like you're saying at the beginning, brother, about God is working more in individual hearts and he's fitting them for the circumstances where they find themselves. And some people, you're going to be extremely evangelistically effective and plant schools and plant churches, start classical Christian schools, do things like that in the States. And then for other people, it may just be planting the seed for the very first time in another context. The goal is not just to be reaching the unreached, as important as that is. The goal is that every nation and tribe and people would have a fully mature body that is doing all the things that Christians do in community as salt and light. And that's not the view of missions we've had for so long. It's just been reach those who aren't reached, and then nothing beyond that about teaching them to obey all things.
And again, it's like I said, it's been encouraging to me to turn around and look back and to go back and, several times a year to be involved in events and with ministries that are incredibly effective, incredibly faithful, that are fighting the good fight. Now, at the same time, I see the craziness, right? It's not that I don't see the craziness. I absolutely see the craziness. And, my Zambian brethren ask me all the time, like, what is wrong with your people? What's wrong with your tribe? Because your tribe is crazy, You don't know what a man is or a woman is, and they don't know, all this kind of crazy stuff, right? So I see the crazy, but I also recognize that, when there's 350 million people, and when there are people who are, pulling certain levers, of power and, controlling certain aspects of media and, these kinds of things, even some of that is given far more sway than it would were it not for those levers that these people can pull. The overwhelming majority of Americans know the difference between a man and a woman. You wouldn't know that. And if all you watch is what's coming out on TV, you would think that, half of America is part of the alphabet mafia and there are no straight married people raising kids anymore. But on the ground, you see that it's not quite like that.
See, you kind of opened the door to this, and I think you've touched on it a few times already, but could you, as we're kind of wrapping this up or coming close to the end, what are some lessons that as most of our listeners are coming from the West, some listeners in the UK, Canada, America for sure, and then our missionary force that's spread all over the world are majorly our listeners. What would be some things that you would say, hey, these are some things that I think we need to learn from the Zambian church? What can we take away from what the Zambian church is getting right?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. In America, there is this abundance and this embarrassment of riches. And so we are very frivolous when it comes to resources in America. But in Zambia, and our churches here, we can't be frivolous when it comes to resources because we don't have those kinds of resources. So churches here are not trying to figure out, how to get a 15th or a 50th full-time staff member, right? I mean, it's just not a thing, you know? And so there's much less of a professionalism in that regard, and much more of an all hands on deck approach to ministry that I think is very healthy. And it's something that I notice more and more, you know, as I go back to the U.S. and as I go to churches. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, you know, with having people in staff positions per se, but it's just striking when I go from here, where most churches, you know, are really hoping to be able to pay a pastor. And then I go, you know, to a place where the, you know, minister to ninth grade boys is making a full-time salary. You know,
I was that guy, so I'm allowed to laugh.
Yeah.
Well, if I could just jump in, I mean, that makes it hard even in the States, though, because here I'm out in the Bay Area. Churches are generally very small.
Yes.
We're very, very post-Christian. It's a very much a mission field. And when I'm trying to recruit young men to come and join me here, I'm often competing with that 15th staff position in which they're going to get, you know, paid enough money to buy a house. And I'm like, hey, come out to the Bay Area. You'll probably never own a home. You're probably going to have to work, you know, some bivocational work, even though you're going to get paid $100,000. You know, like you still won't be able to afford to live here.
Yeah, you'll give you $100,000 and you can still get food stamps, right?
You're not. We're laughing, but that's the truth. That's absolutely the truth.
Listen, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, man. I know, man. I know.
We view Los Angeles as cheap compared to Bay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, but it is. It's an interesting. You know, it's just a very interesting. It's a very interesting thing. And the other thing too is, like, churches here. You know, you'll have people right next to each other who, you know, this person is a maid, or, you know, a full-time, you know, gardener at somebody's house, or, you know, has some, you know, kind of cart where they're selling things on the side of the road and barely scraping by. And then over here you have somebody who's, you know, some highfalutin, you know, government muckety muck, or, you know, some great job with some NGO or whatever. And it's strange how in the Zambian context, you don't get that sense of rivalry and jealousy that you do almost inevitably in the American context. You know, if you had people.
Yeah, because we've sold jealousy as you know, as the fuel and the currency of social change and social movements, right, and of revolution, right. It's fueled on jealousy, and if I could just make something a little more explicit as we wind down, just so we can contextualize what you're saying, brother. So there is this critique of some of the writing in missions from 10, 15 years ago that said that mission-minded people need to be radical. We do have this embarrassment of riches in the U.S. We need to steward it better. We need to give ourselves away with reckless abandon, because look how needy the rest of the world is, and the disproportionate amount of blessing that we enjoy. We have to answer for that. That was where a lot of the energy was in maybe a previous era of missions thinking. And there's been pushback on that to say, get your own house in order, build your church locally, do the things that Christians should be doing to be a blessing in your context. What I hear you saying in the midst of that bigger conversation is, well, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We really do have a lot here in the States, and how we steward that is going to look different. But what we can't do is forget that we've been given so much, and to whom much is given, much still is in fact required.
Yeah, Luke 19 still in the Bible.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that stewardship is not just stewardship is not about being embarrassed at what the Lord has given you. Stewardship is about using what He's given you wisely. And I think the problem in those prior critiques is that, you know, once you have that that bent of, you need to be embarrassed, you need to be ashamed, you're almost bringing on board that neo-Marxist oppressed ideology, right? And you're kind of bringing on board that worldview that says, wealth beyond a certain point has to be considered illegitimate, and you need to be guilted out of it, and that's hugely problematic.
Yeah, to whom much is given, much is indeed required. Well, Voddie, many people are familiar with your public ministry, but please share where would you point people so that they can hear not only more of what you've written and produced over the years, they can certainly find that, but on these types of topics too, and looking at what God is doing across the globe, and maybe even particularly through ACU, how can they learn more about that as well?
Yeah, they can go to acu-zambia.com and find out information about that there. I've also started another ministry called Muzulu.org, MUZULU.org, and they can, find out information there as well. But, I'm so encouraged by the fact that people can access information like this, that, they don't have to. It used to be the only time people heard about missions from a first person perspective is if their church was blessed enough to have missionaries who would come back, for the missions day and dress up in the garb of the people that they're ministering to and tell their stories or whatever. And praise God for, churches that have done that and that can do that. But I think it's incredible that, that there are outlets like this where people can hear about things that folks are doing. I'm grateful for your work. I'm grateful for, the book that you and Chad have written to help people think more biblically about this, whole process. And my prayer is that people both there and here will think more missiologically, that they'll think more in terms of the kingdom and its advancement and what all of us can contribute to that and how all of us need to be passionate about that.
Amen. And that is why we exist, don't we, Scott? To help goers think and help thinkers go. And both of those things need to be done. And the Missions Podcast is, of course, a ministry of ABWE. And so to learn more about ABWE, you can go to abwe.org. Thank you, Voddie, for being on the show today. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us as well. By the way, you can watch this if you're just an audio listener. You can also go to ABWE's YouTube channel and watch the content here as well. Don't you want to see Scott Dunford's beautiful, radiant, California tanned face compared to my pasty pale? Of course, I guess Voddie wins the tanning competition for the day here on the show. But moving along from that.
We know where all the mail's going to be coming.
That's right. That's right. Email your complaints to scott@missionspodcast.com. Oh boy. And with that, we thank you for joining us today. Until next week's episode, go make disciples of all nations, and we'll see you then.